Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. Welcome to the Foresight session on disability-inclusive road transport, sponsored by the UK Department for International Development and the Department of Transport. We are really excited today to be able to have this discussion. It's an important topic that typically hasn't been discussed as forums such as this. We are also very fortunate today to have a very esteemed panel of guest speakers and panelists. We have designed the session in two parts. So we'll have the first part, have a break, and then come back to the second part. For the first part, we will start off with a keynote address. The keynote will be presented by Ms. Daniela. And Ms. Daniela is a director at the United Nations Department for Inclusive Social and Economic Affairs. We will then pivot to our panel. And on our panel, we have Ms. Mary Crass. And Mary is the head of Institutional Relations and Summit International Transport Forum for the OECD. We will then have Professor Pan, who's from the Department of Urban Planning from the Tongji University in China. And then we will have Saeed Mohammed, who's a global senior transport specialist from the Islamic Development Bank. And then we will have Ms. Claire Smith, who's the head of Transportation Accessibility Policy in Scotland. After which I will moderate, hopefully, a short question and answer section, and then we will take a break. So again, welcome to this session. My name is Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, and I am the Global Disability Advisor for the World Bank Group, and I'm really delighted to be able to moderate this session this morning. I wanted to start off with providing a few framing remarks. And I'm sure many of the other speakers will reiterate some of these points. But I think it's important for us to locate today's discussion in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals are important because they set key targets that address safety, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all by 2030. It's also important to recognize that this target, Target 11.2, makes explicit reference to persons with disabilities and the need to have accessible transportation for persons with disabilities. There are a couple of things that we do know. One of the things that we know is that accessible public transport for persons with disabilities is an absolute lifeline to how people with disabilities access education, how they access employment, how they access healthcare, but also importantly, how they maintain social contacts and contracts. It's important in terms of how they interact with their families, with their communities. And transportation, accessible transportation, allows them, enables them to live independently, and in so doing, contribute to society, which we know is fundamental to breaking the spiral of poverty, dependency, and exclusion. But let's for a minute just think a bit about the size of the population that we're talking about. In 2011, the World Bank and WHO put out a report called the World Disability Report. And in that report, it estimates that persons with disabilities make up 15% of the world's population. And 80% of persons with disabilities live in developing countries. It's also important to note that persons with disabilities can become disabled as a result of from birth, but they can also acquire disabilities later on in their lives. Finally, I'd like to conclude my opening remarks by mentioning the fact that there are economic issues around keeping persons with disabilities out of economies. So we have to think about that. We have to think about the economic terms of exclusion. we also have to think about the social terms of exclusion. And I believe that my panel will share with us some of those thoughts as we proceed. So what I'd like to do right now is to invite the keynote speaker, Ms. Daniela Bas. Daniela, please.
Thank you. Give me 5. Good morning. Glasses, iPad, memory, pictures. And I have 15 minutes. First of all, I would like to, well, let me go behind here. If you can see me, can you? Kind of. I would like to thank the DFID and, of course, the World Road Association for having invited me here. The World Road Association was created almost 110 years ago. They had a vision. And today, with your participation and your help, I would like to add vision to the vision. 110 years passed by, and I think that roads have changed, and the people who use the roads have changed, and the means of transportation that use roads have changed. So probably it is also time for us to change the way we think of roads. As Charlotte said, I'm the director of the Division for Inclusive Social Development at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York. And when we say inclusive, we mean that all people of all ages and of all abilities are included in our policies, in the policies we develop. So the division I lead for the department, for the whole United Nations system globally, is the focal point on youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, the family, cooperatives that are social enterprises, as well as sport for development and peace. And all of these social groups and these issues use roads. When we have to commute from A to B, either for working reasons, healthcare reasons, sport, leisure, fun, study, we need roads. And we do know that the world is demographically changing very fast, and by the year 2050, around 65–68% of the population will be living in urban areas, and the remaining part of the population will be in rural areas. So we have to think about roads also for urban areas and rural areas in order for them to be accessible, to be inclusive of all the people of different ages and different abilities. They have to be affordable as well. We saw the picture, you know, a few images of that documentary saying that that lady cannot take public transportation because it is far too expensive. So they have to be affordable as well. And they have to be usable. And when I say usable, I think about the environment. There is the road, yes, but the road is in an environment. And what does that environment offer? Imagine that you are driving on a highway and you need to stop to have a rest. Are there, along that road, restaurants that are accessible and usable? Or toilets that are accessible and usable? And so when we plan roads, be that they are in far, far rural areas of very small villages, we have to think that we have to connect those villages with roads. But they have to be accessible to all people. India has a set of very interesting examples about that. So, as Charlotte said, we have 17 goals. 194 countries agreed to adopt the 2030 agenda with its 17 goals. Goals that have to be achieved by the year 2030, exactly. So one of these goals is the goal number 11, that has already been mentioned by Charlotte. And this goal says that all countries and all stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I mean NGOs, academia, individuals, the private sector, governments, et cetera, all of these are stakeholders, are committed by providing, by the year 2030, access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all. So when I said I would like to bring here to the vision of 110 years ago, additional vision, I'm talking about a new culture of accessibility. A new culture of accessibility requires that you, engineers, planners, etc., change your mindset to change then the mindset of others. Actually, by doing that, you will promoting inclusion in your own way. But what a wonderful way of doing that. So what is, and see, I completely forgot about my slides, by the way. Let me see. What is, I don't know how to use it. Okay. The economic and social imperative of accessible roads. So here it is, the 2030 agenda with its 17 goals. This is what the United Nations are doing, and as I said, we engage with all those different stakeholders. And when it comes to the social and economic imperatives of accessibility, we know that, as I said, by the year 2050, 68% of the world will be living in urbanized areas. And so we have to make sure that when we change our culture in terms of accessibility, we keep in mind the infrastructures, the roads, and the transportation as well. And this applies also to rural areas, as I said. So the United Nations is really working very hard in terms of raising awareness on why accessible transport is fundamental for sustainable development. Think of pedestrians and road infrastructures. They should have the flexibility to accommodate each user's needs and preferences. And this can include physical accessibility, but also financial accessibility, and especially for those people who have low income. And when we talk about persons with disabilities, please let's keep in mind that persons with disabilities could be persons who have a physical disability like mine, but it could be visual or hearing impaired, so a sensory disability. It could be cognitive or mental or else disability. And it could be also invisible disabilities. We don't see them. Say that a person is, has a very weak heart, etc., etc. So there are many kinds of disabilities. Let's not think that persons with disabilities belong to the same group, and because we are all different. So when you're planning, you have also to keep in mind all these differences. You see, the world, demographically speaking, is changing very fast. The world is getting more and more old, with the exception of Africa, that it is still growing very young. Until the year 2100, Africa will have additional 420 million young people. When I say young, it's between the age of 14 to the age of 25. And when I say old, I mean people older than the age of 60. So in an aging world, we have to keep in mind that not necessarily, but age can bring with it disabling conditions, if not disabilities per se. And we can happen to have a temporary disability. Say we break our leg, and for a while we have to wear a cast. So when we talk about accessible and inclusive roads, we really have to take into consideration all this realm of the population, with specific focus, of course, to people with disabilities, since this seminar today, this meeting, this workshop, this dialogue is focusing on persons with disabilities. And remember, as Carlos said, a disability can be acquired in many different ways. And in a world where there are more and more natural disasters, unless we make sure that our roads are safe and we can use them to escape from these natural disasters, more and more people not only will die, but will acquire additional new disabilities. Just to give you an example. So I would like to illustrate a little bit more some of these points when it comes to persons with disabilities. Let's focus on these more than 1 billion people out of the 7-8 billion people that are living on our planet nowadays. You see, when we think of accessible roads, why are they important? Well, because we have the 2030 agenda and disability is mentioned in many of those goals. And as I said, there is SDG 11 that specifically focuses on roads. But we also have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that has been adopted out of 194 countries united in one organization, that is the United Nations Organization. Almost 180 have ratified the convention. Accessible roads lead to more accessible education, healthcare, and employment. Accessible roads improve the ability of everyone to participate in social, economic, political, and cultural activities. Accessible roads support a growing accessibility tourism industry. Bingo, economy. I will give you an example in a second. Accessible roads means safe roads for all. The number of older persons is expected to double over the next 4 decades and reach 2 billion people in 2050. It's a huge number. More than 1 billion people worldwide experience some form of disability, and universal design benefits everyone of all ages and of all abilities. So I think that this already gives us an idea of why accessible roads are important. But let me give you 2 specific examples about also not only the social but the economic benefits. Transportation is key, as we said, for the largest industry in the world. And that largest industry in the world could be considered, for instance, tourism. If we want to go from A to B, we have to use roads. Well, there are many kinds of roads, but now we're thinking of the traditional definition of roads. In my language, in Italian, a road is also on air. The railways are roads, so roads can be many things, but now we're talking about the classical, traditional definition of road. So approximately 15–20% of the global market is lost when it comes to tourism because of lack of accessibility. According to the Australian National Visitor Survey that was taken a few years ago, something like 88% of people with the disabilities take a holiday each year that accounted for something like 8.2 million overnight trips. Another example of economic importance of accessible, inclusive, and sustainable transportation is shown by the studies of the Inter-American Institute on Disability and Inclusive Development in the States. It goes back again of a couple of years ago. And the studies have shown that American adults with the disabilities spend an average of $13.6 billion annually on travel. So, if not because it's a social imperative, but at least it is an economic imperative to make roads accessible and inclusive. I do not know how much time I have left. 1 minute. Okay, so the challenges are many. Awareness raising. We have to be consistent and joint in our approach. We should include training when it comes to accessibility and inclusion into the courses that architects, engineers, etc., and those who are specializing in urban planning are taking. It should be compulsory. Accessibility standards and legal and financial frameworks have to be considered. It's not enough to be a planner and an architect who got the right training and the right education. Governments also have to engage with planners and developers and people in general, so to make sure that participation and inclusion of all vulnerable groups is there. What does it mean for all of us? Well, there are good practices that I will be more than happy to share with you later on during the conversation, but I would like to conclude by saying that building accessible roads is a matter of justice as well as a common sense and an investment in the future. And if you take one message away from this event today, let it be that inclusion is not only a legal obligation, it is also both an economic and a social imperative. So let us work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you for really underscoring the importance of thinking about disability or the population of persons with disabilities as not a homogeneous group. This is essential for planning, for building roads, to think about the diversity for which the population is. Now I would like to pivot to the panel, and the panel has self-subscribed to a number of questions. And so I can assume that each one of you will have thought through the questions and will speak to the questions that you want to answer. So I'm going to immediately go to Mary. And Mary, if we could get some of your thinking about the importance of this issue, let's hear it from you.
Can you hear me? Great. Good morning. Good morning to everybody, and thank you very much, Charlotte. Following on to Daniela's words and Charlotte's words, I'd like to just recall one element, an additional element of the context in which we are having this conversation about accessibility. I think we have all observed and are a part of a period of transformation in transport and mobility that is absolutely unprecedented in scope and complexity, where innovation is burgeoning in all parts of the sector. It is emerging from the sector, and it is affected by innovation that is coming in from elsewhere across the economy. All kinds of disruptive innovation is redefining the way individuals get around and companies transport their goods. These include, of course, things like app-based ride services, transport network companies, shared taxis, the bundled services that are a part of mobility as a service, all these types of new forms of service provision, connected infrastructures and vehicles, they all offer compelling opportunities to enhance the ability of all travelers, and that means including those with some form of either permanent or temporary impairment to their mobility. So new opportunities for all of us to access jobs, public services, healthcare, etc. But it's very important that we recognize that these innovative advancements in infrastructure and services and the technologies on which they are based will only provide benefits to society, and this is absolutely essential, if they are easy to access for all travelers. And this is not the case right now. So we are losing a whole range of benefit to a significant segment of the population. And this just reflects that one of the most persistent mistakes that we as transport professionals, analysts, authorities, infrastructure providers, and operators continue to make is in looking at accessibility as a marginal problem, an afterthought, a specific issue for a specific segment of the population that enables us in the planning process to relegate it to the margins and not put it at the core. We don't understand as a sector yet the essential nature of this. In fact, as Daniela highlighted, when you add to individuals that have some form of physical, sensory, or cognitive disability, the growing number of older people, Daniela, you spoke to this quite in a compelling way, excuse me, the number of older people in many countries, as well as all of us at some point that need to get around when carrying suitcases or dragging children or when we have temporary injuries. We are automatically talking a very, very significant portion of the traveling public. Yeah. Yet accessibility, as I mentioned, it remains in the margin of transport planning and policy today. After all these years of thinking about this, of working towards better analysis in this area, it still remains in the margins of transport policy. This is certainly the case for road transport, and this is what we're focusing on this week. But it is applicable to all topics right across this sector, all forms of transport. And this is even though the UN Convention and the SDGs, et cetera, provide a clear rights-based framework for fully integrating accessibility into transport and mobility planning and policy. And it's in spite of quite comprehensive disability rights or accessibility legislation in a growing number of countries across the globe. So why is implementation of accessibility still so difficult? And I'd like to cite 2 areas for reflection before relinquishing the mic. First, we are observing that in a number of countries that actually have strong accessibility legislation in place, comprehensive, integrated, et cetera, implementation of the law is stumbling. Responsibility for accessibility improvements set out in legislation has been devolved to local authorities in many cases, which is appropriate, of course, in many cases, without commensurate sources of funding and without adequate monitoring of the legislation. A last point, there needs to be further exploration of wider economic benefits of accessibility. And Daniela, you referred to this as well. The direct costs of retrofitting equipment and infrastructure are well known and often cited as a constraint on improving access. But less well identified and understood are the wider costs to society of not providing accessible transport infrastructure, equipment, and services. And this hinders access of a large number of travelers to all the amenities, jobs, services, etc. One last point, if you would allow me. The lack of a common framework to value the economic benefits of accessibility continues to constrain investment and regulatory decisions in this area. We need to improve understanding of how these benefits should be defined, quantified, and incorporated in a consistent valuation framework. The evidence we do have is that the magnitude of potential benefits from better accessibility right across the sector is often large enough to cover the costs. But we need to strengthen the body of quantitative evidence in this area, supporting rights-based legislation with a robust economic case for accessibility. My last comment, the ITF has begun to further investigate these questions, but more effort is needed right across the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Some quick takeaways that I take from your presentation is to not think about accessibility as an afterthought. I think that's a really important piece. And then also the point that I think a very, very valid one you made is that accessibility presenting itself as a constraint to investment.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing for us to think about as well. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'd like to now invite Professor Pan. And Professor Pan, as you make your remarks, if you could think a bit about how we can change mindsets. So over to you.
Okay. So in China, actually, we have very strong legislation and also constitution have some elements to support the disabled people. And for the transports, we, for a long time, pay attention to the bicycle. So we are lucky enough, we have the bicycle lane. And the government subsidized for the disabled people with motorized three-wheel. So it's very effective for them to use motorized three-wheel travel around. But the difficulty is transport is the door-to-door, the whole process is not only one piece of this segment, but the transport system is quite a fragment. So if you get from one place to another place, sometimes you find it difficult to get a service, to get into the building. And why it happens is because people think disabled people is just a small percentage, a minority. So we can have some temporal support for them for example, once I noticed a video show that one woman take children on the stroller to try to use the lift in the underground. It takes three minutes for her to ask someone to help them, to push the button and open the door of the lift. So this, they think we should specific design for disabled people actually make the disabled people very difficult, or the people very difficult. And the challenge for us is that we are aging, especially for the mega city, more and more aging society. Like in Shanghai, in 2010, we have 10 people for 100,000 population. Now we have 70 people of the age of 100 years old with 100,000 population. So we have more and more people get aged. These people are not classified as disabled people previously. So they have no license. So it means they have no social support. We totally neglect this. And this, we need a lot of effort, family support for their life. And the other issue is the disabled people living in the rural area. So they are very difficult to get access to the to service. So I visited some of the family in the rural area. When their children get some ill and not medicine care, and then he gets become the disabled, then the families really have the trouble. So this is also one of the issue. The other issue is we also neglect the importance of visitor, because the visitor, we have not designed the system. If the visitor is a disabled people, or if the visitor is with the luggage, we can find it's very difficult for them to work around. So all these issues should be linked together. And in China, we have a very strong technical stand. But the technical stand is good for faster implementation. But the effectiveness of this implementation is still a question. How to get the awareness from the bottom up is also one of the challenges for us. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Pan. Thank you. Thank you very much for introducing the concept of universal design. I think that's a really important piece for colleagues to think about, because we know that if you design well, it works for everybody. And that translates very well to roads. And I also think the point you made around technical standards is a very important one to mention, because increasingly we see countries have technical standards, but they're often not implemented. And so that is something that we need to think about as practitioners, as policymakers. So our next panelist is Mr. Mohammed. And Mr. Mohammed, I'm going to hand over to you, and I'd like you to perhaps think a bit about what influence do international financial organizations have in relation to addressing issues around inclusive transportation and inclusive roads? Please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm from the as a financial institution, our role is to basically finance new projects. So what we can do is we can advise countries about what they could do. Usually, sometimes we visit countries and we do like a sector overview. So we go, let's say that for us, we go do the transport sector overview. We can advise countries on what they can do to help people with disabilities as a component of the road, especially when it goes into like the cities, which unfortunately we as an MDB we don't do. We usually concentrate on mega projects. So some of these projects may not include this element. However, if it goes through like rural areas, people sometimes, this road would split their land, so they would need access from overpass or some kind of like a tunnel, a small tunnel. We ensure that this could be done. The other thing, besides advising, we could recommend projects. We don't have that influence of pushing people to do things. Hopefully, we hope that like there are some international agreements, something like the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, everybody agrees upon. There's some consensus. We can push people. We can do some awareness sessions. We can do some, through funding, we finance these projects. And also through implementation, we could assist them with technical assistance. If they need a road, we can tell them, okay, you have this. You can, through awareness, you could at least just numbers could make sense. If you tell people that there's 1 billion people with disabilities, that should click. If you tell them that there's like 30 million injuries on the road accidents leading to, some of them leading to disabilities, numbers could click. That gives you, that's like equivalent to 100,000 injuries every day on the road. 100,000 injuries. That is something that if you think about, as engineers, we like to play with numbers, but as financial institutions, that's what you can do. You can spread awareness, you can assist with implementation, and advice with technical assistance. What we did in Islamic Development Bank, for example, we started late. We didn't actually have a policy for the past 40 years. So we developed our policy last year, and the theme was inclusion and prosperity. And when we say inclusion here, we mean that you're leaving no one behind, including people with disabilities. What the Islamic Development Bank, along with other MDBs, we agreed upon, we try to push for the SDGs. Since everybody, all the countries, is coming through the United Nations, so SDGs are a good starting point where you're going to finance a project. You ask people, okay, you have agreed on such and such, so let's do it. So SDGs, luckily they have like five straight SDGs related to people with disabilities. If I remember, they are like 4, 8, 10, 11, and 17. All of these talk about people with disabilities, something related to education, access to education, access to fair to transportation. So all of these, as an MDB, we have like a budget, approval budget of 5 billion a year. 2 of those go through infrastructure, and through infrastructure, we're talking about all these transport, we're talking about energy, we're talking about education, healthcare. So all of these projects that we finance, we try to push. But you can push to a certain extent. You don't have the power to force people to do something. But what we can do as a financial institution, we can spread the awareness. I think this is the #1 issue, is that people are, usually the awareness level is, people know it, but they don't know, they may need more evidence to start moving towards and believe in what you say. So when you start throwing out these numbers, the numbers really click. When you throw out like videos like the one we saw this morning, yeah, it really gives you something to take out with you out of this room and just spread the word. So basically, this is what we can do. We can just, bottom line, we can finance projects, but the planning and the implementation really relies on the country themselves, because we finance countries, and then we try to help them implement if they can. But really, the bottom line, it is the country's responsibility, as we can only finance, we are only a financial institution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing the perspective from the MDBs. I think the importance of advisory services is really key. I think that tells the audience that technical assistance exists. So there are people that know what needs to happen. And I think what we're beginning to see already is a recurring theme around the SDGs. And I'm sure that makes you very happy, Daniela. And now we're going to pivot to Claire. And Claire, what I would like you to think about a bit is, what are some of the key drivers for inclusive transportation in the minutes that you have?
Okay, thank you very much. Can I start first of all by saying Scotland is delighted to be here today, particularly with the Disability Inclusive Road Transport agenda and being able to speak here this morning. Scotland has had a long-standing relationship with the World Road Congress, and as I say, absolutely delighted to have this opportunity. On enablers, absolutely, I'll talk through what we've done to design accessible framework and how that is now seen and genuinely seen within the Scottish Government as an enabler. We have, as background, within Scotland, we have 5.4 million citizens. 20% have said that they have a long-term illness or describe themselves as a disability. In 2002, we realised that not only is it socially and morally right to do something about making sure that everyone can travel with the same choice, freedom and dignity, we realised that we needed to come up with a strategic framework to make sure that everyone was able to travel with that same choice, freedom and dignity. So in 2003 and 2004, we worked with external stakeholders within Scotland. We also engaged with people across the UK and also across Europe. And it took us 2 years to develop what we call as our 10-year accessible travel framework. Now, this framework was co-produced, and that's one of the key things I would highlight if you're trying to enable a strategic change like this within your own country. If you're not working with your framework as something that's co-produced across the country, ownership will not be felt, and if ownership's not felt, it's very likely that the actual framework will not be delivered. I've got it here just to show. So within that framework there were, and I'll let people see that after this, within the framework there's 48 issues. But what became very clear to us was that these issues would, through time, some of them would be done automatically for some of the other processes, but some not. And we knew then that we needed to do something different, and we've changed to an annual delivery plan. Now, what we've done is we have made it very clear within government, and Scottish Government ministers are clear of this, is that this is not solely a responsibility. Getting public transport accessible to all is not solely a responsibility for transport ministers. Health ministers, justice ministers, education, etc. And we are very fortunate in Scotland because they absolutely see this as critical. Critical because we need to realise the wealth of experience and knowledge of all citizens. So we need to get everyone able to participate fully within society. One of the things we then done was establish a Mobility and Access Committee, 15 public appointees who actually are our critical friend, and they work very closely with ministers across each of the portfolios. Now, this work itself, as I said, is very much, it takes slightly longer than you would expect, but it's worthwhile making sure that it's co-produced if you really want to enable that change. To give you an idea of the changes that's happened within Scotland, 5 years ago, each of the large airports in Scotland were seen as very poor around accessibility. Today, those 5 airports, the key 5 airports, and 2 now are slightly larger, so they're in now. So now we've got 5 airports in Scotland who are seen as very good by the Civil Aviation Authority, so we really are starting to see change. With a few years ago, it was you would be over 24 hours before you would receive passenger assistance in railway. Today it's 1 hour, and we have over 7,000 wheelchair spaces in our railways every day. So we really are starting to see progress, but we realise that we want to do more. We're very ambitious, and we want to be seen as an accessible nation. We want the UN to be citing Scotland as one of those who's met their targets, but we need your help to do that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for sharing the Scottish experience. I think very practical, some very key messages coming out there. I think underscoring the importance of dignity as it relates to transport and, and accessible roads. The importance of working with the user. I think that's an important piece to take away. The absolute need to have policies and frameworks to guide your own teams in terms of what needs to happen. And then I think you highlighted the importance of having multidisciplinary approaches to accessibility. So what I'd like to do now is to open the floor out and see if there are any questions to the panelists. If you could just say your name, and if your question or comment is directed to a particular speaker, I'd appreciate that. Yes, sir, please.
Roy Brannan, Chief Exec, Transport Scotland, Scottish Government. Claire has undersold her position in taking forward the framework and the action plan. I'm very proud that the work that's going on with the team. And a couple of areas that we've been talking about recently where I think a few of the panel members mentioned that we need to do more work around is, one is training. So training throughout our organisations, and that's not just in the delivery element, but also the policymakers. And the second is in procurement. So we have quite a powerful lever within procurement, and I think it's underutilised. I think Dr. Mohammed mentioned the potential there for financing institutions to really lever in what we actually want delivered, as well as that infrastructure and that transport facilities. So just open to the panel, but what more can we do to embed those two particular things as we move forward into this trajectory of real delivery and change?
Great, thank you. Can we get another question, and then I'll come back to the panel? Anne?
Thank you. Anne Fry, independent consultant. We've heard from Mary and from others about the problem that accessibility is still regarded as marginal, as an afterthought. There have been suggestions that it's high time that we saw accessibility as an economic benefit, not as an economic cost. What would the panel suggest is the way to tackle that? We've talked about it for 10 years, but we've not achieved it. What can we actually do to make that turnaround? Thank you.
Great question, thank you. One last question, maybe? Great.
Good morning, everybody. Fantastic talks and presentations. My name's Graham from United Kingdom as well. I wonder whether the panel thinks that the road sector can learn from some other transport sectors who maybe are a little bit better about this, and particularly in thinking of disabled people as customers rather than someone who has to be dealt with in a kind of philanthropic way. So I think, for example, about cruise ship operators who know that disabled people, people with mobility difficulties, older people, are a huge segment of their market and respond accordingly. It's not perfect, because a cruise ship's quite a difficult environment, but nevertheless, they take it very seriously. And I wonder how you can transfer that sort of mindset into the roads administrations.
Okay, great. A great set of questions, and I'm going to ask the panel. I'll start. Anybody to take the first question around what can we do more in terms of training, and how can we look more at procurement as a way to make sure that we're addressing accessibility from the get-go. So, any takers on that? Mohammed?
Let me take, thank you for the great questions. I would just like to, as I mentioned, the awareness factor. If you're not aware of something, that means you think there's no problem, it does not exist. So awareness, how can I help the countries be aware of the situation? If you just, what countries are thinking about, for example, income, at the income level, if you tell people that you are losing 15% of your population are not, for example, paying taxes, you are actually subsidizing you're adding more money for people with disabilities. Who's paying for that? It's the rest of the people. So how can we utilize, we can utilize the unused potential of 15% to give you more taxes, so that's income for the country. That's less spending on people with disabilities. So this just awareness could raise that, could help people. But how can you do it? It's not, I don't think it's a one organization. It's the efforts of everybody. As a financial institution, we can't do it alone, because we are limited. Our projects, like I mentioned earlier, they are mega projects. When you talk about $2 billion for road projects, each road project costs about $200 to $300 million. So you're talking about what? Seven projects. So just the countries, yeah, we're going to do some awareness, but it's not going to be enough. You need to do more. So it's just us, MDBs and NGOs, everybody should push for that. Just like people now are pushing for climate change, you need to keep talking about it to people. It is important. This is 15% of our population are not being used the right way. They are not getting enough income. They are not getting access to jobs, fair education, fair health care, everything. Accessibility is hard. So how can you do that? Just, in my opinion, it would be everywhere you go, spread the word. Spread the word and let people know about the reality of the issue. It's not just that we sit and talk. No, just spread the word, and just once you come out of this room, go out and spread it, and do whatever you can.
So just on the training, I think Daniela had mentioned in her presentation that I think that we need to move to ensure that accessibility is mandatory. It becomes a mandatory piece of our education. And so that's a good place to start. I think currently we often see it as an elective, and I think that getting people, architects, road engineers, everybody to understand what accessibility looks like is a good start. But Anne had a great question around how we start thinking about accessibility as an economic benefit, and maybe Mary, I'll give that question to you to start off, to kick off with.
Yeah, sure, thank you very much. It's true that we are, as I said, and I think many of us recognize, we are quite able to identify the direct costs, but particularly when accessibility improvements to the system come downstream in the process, where there is no time and very, very constrained resource to take on board these enhancements. What needs to happen, and I would say in many cases legislation at the national level already provides for this. It's just not enforced in many, many cases. But this planning for accessibility needs to be brought into long-term strategic transport planning. We're talking about 10, 20-year planning when it concerns large infrastructure, et cetera, so that it can be absolutely absorbed in investment from the beginning. And then it is fully integrated in the financing plan, and we actually see results downstream. And so that's absolutely essential to bring it forward in the planning process and fully integrate it therein. We haven't done much work exploring the wider economic benefits of accessibility. There has been, we at the International Transport Forum have done some, I would say, early exploration of this topic, but we don't have a lot of knowledge out there to really work with. However, logic would have it that if we understand that we are not talking about the proverbial 10% of the population that we throw around in transport planning, but upwards of 30% or more at any given time, when you bring on board the variety of transport users and clientele that will benefit from these, we're going to see greater benefits. And we just need to be able to construct a narrative that is based on very sound empirical evaluation. And we can do that. I think there needs to be more impetus to do that kind of work. And then we construct an economic argument that accompanies the rights-based legislation that is there. If I might just add one more point, and that is that the legislation, I mean, there are a number of countries that have very comprehensive legislation. The UK, of course, is one and has for many, many years. Canada is just concluding a period of really redoing their whole accessibility and disability legislative framework. Many, many countries have it. What needs to happen, though, is that the funding framework for this needs to be seen upstream. What has happened, for example, in France, and I don't know if there's anybody from France here, is that responsibility for all of this has been devolved to local authorities and regional authorities without the capacity to raise the money at that level to be able to finance these improvements. So then people back off, and that's the first thing that gets set aside, put off, or extended in time period. And it's that kind of a dynamic that we really need to work on. That's what I might say.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask each one of you to think about one key message that you'd like to leave the audience with, and then we will break for a bit. And if maybe we could pick up on Graham's question around how we flip it so that we're thinking about persons with disabilities as customers. And I think the cruise ship analogy is a good one. And Daniela, maybe we kick off with you, because I know you've done work around disability and accessible tourism.
Tourism. Traveling, you know, people travel for religious reasons, health reasons, leisure reasons, adventure, discovering places. So there are so many different reasons for engaging in travel and tourism. And I shared with you just a couple of examples, powerful examples, of the social and economic benefits of making sure that roads and whatever is used on roads transportation, once they are accessible and inclusive and affordable, hopefully, the kind of benefits that they bring to the people and to the planet, and therefore the environment. I would like to say that no projects should be approved, neither services or products, unless they are accessible and inclusive. And this means to implement the 2030 agenda with its 17 goals that has been adopted by 194 countries. And this agenda is universal, and each of these 194 countries, of which we are members, have to be accountable. And it's a universal agenda. To be accountable, it means that each country of these 194 has to report to other countries. Once they meet at the United Nations during the General Assembly once per year, or in July when they share on a voluntary basis their reports. They have to report how they are implementing the 2030 agenda, its 17 goals, 169 indicators, and in this case, since we are focusing on persons with disabilities, the 30 articles of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So it is our work and our job to make sure that what countries have agreed upon, they implement it at national level, and they put these things into their policy and strategic frameworks at national level. You see, rights are very important, but unless we develop strong policy frameworks at national level, rights cannot be implemented. They remain laws in books, in the bookshelf. So this is our job, to make sure that whatever policies are designed or improved that have also an impact on the laws, and therefore have an impact on whatever relates to the cultural, social, economic, political, environmental dimensions, nothing is going to be approved unless it is absolutely inclusive and absolutely accessible, at least when it comes to having a minimum common denominator of what accessibility and inclusion is for all countries. We all have different definitions of what accessibility is, of what disability is, of what inclusion is. This I understand, but there are some basic common denominators that have been discussed, negotiated, and adopted by 194 countries at the United Nations. Thanks.
Great. Mary, each one a very short comment. Mary.
Sorry.
Perhaps I would just, my very short comment would just be to follow on to what you just said, Daniela, about procurement. I would just like to cite that in 1999, I believe it was, upwards of 42, 43 ministers of transport agreed a statement that was on procurement of infrastructure. And in that statement on procurement of infrastructure was that no financing would be made available unless it was fully accessible. Now, that was in 1999, and I think we can all agree that that certainly has not been implemented across the board. So I think, so why is that? And this comes back to what I was trying to convey earlier, is that we have really wonderful statements out there. We have the resolution, we've got the SDGs, we've got some very strong statements that have emerged from the organization that I have the honor to work for on accessibility over a long period of years. So what is it? And I'm thinking that what we don't yet have is that accompanying economic argument that we know intuitively is there. We just need to make that very clear so that it can come in as flanking action to these very, very good statements that have already been made about what we need to do. And so I think this, I might suggest today, is perhaps where PIARC could help us to really focus and let the road sector be a leader in this area, to really help with road infrastructure and come on with some very strong commitments to ensure that road infrastructure is accessible, and make that a part of your new DNA, if you will.
Excellent. Great challenge.
Yep.
Professor Pan?
Yes. So I think we should think about the future vision. So in next 50 year, 100 year, what's the built environment we will live in, and what's the support we will have. So one thing is clear: we need to help each other, and this help not only from the normal people, but also we shall use the capacity of people with disability, because they can do a lot of job. So if you look at the security check people, why? We use the young man. So disabled people can do this. And if someone look at the monitor, they can do this. So all this, if you go to the village in China, you can find the old lady of 75, they still do some piece of work. Then this work can be combined to some luxury goods. So if everything is linked well, we have a huge capacity. But currently it seems to be this part of people is isolated from the society. So we shall think about how we can link them together. In regarding to the safety issue, previously, when we design the route, the objective of this vision is efficiency. Efficiency for car, efficiency for vehicle, but improve the efficiency, it means people get very difficult to cross the street. So, for the people with disabled, they will find that it's not easy to live in this kind of urban environmental. Maybe we should think about in the future, we can have some of the international organizers to initiate some of the inclusive city day. So we need international support, not only from the local city, each country, but it's international-wide. We should think about the capacity we can link them together.
Thank you. Mr. Mohammed, very brief, very
Very
short.
briefly, I would say two things. First is policies, national policies, has to adopt all of what we talked about. The second thing is not just policies. You have to set up, like, following the policy comes the strategy. The strategy is where you set up goals, and then following the strategy comes the implementation plan. How are you going to reach those goals? So I would say, first of all, is national policies. Next is strategy and implementation plans. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Claire, the final word.
To make it work within your own country, you need to embed it and be seen as each minister has to have some responsibility, shared responsibility in this agenda. Like we've done in Scotland, every pound that we spend, our budget each year, budget lines have got an equality impact assessment, so they are measured. What we procure in the Scottish Government has conditions within it that not only are we asking companies to make sure they're compliant with legislation, we're expecting them to go much further than what legislation is asking them to do if they want to procure work with us from what we're trying to procure. Also, what we grant fund across many areas in government. It could be active travel, it could be electric vehicles, many things. We ask for, there are conditions built into our grant funding. And the last point I would say, what is absolutely crucial is that the knowledge and expertise of the user with the disability must be involved at concept stage. And that's concept stage of actually whether you're actually making something or creating some sort of framework or strategy. That is of paramount importance.
Well, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should give them a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Foresight session on disability inclusive road transport. This is the second session, and it's sponsored by UK Department for International Development and the Department of Transport. For this session, what we will do is have a similar format to the last. So we will have a keynote speaker, and then we will have a panel. We will open up for Q&A, a moderated session, and I really encourage you all to be active and engage in that. For our keynote, we're really fortunate to have Mr. Mohammed Yousuf with us here today. Mohammed is a research transportation specialist at the US Federal Highways Administration, and he's also the founder and president of an organization called Quality Able Foundation based in the United States. So Mohammed will present us with some big picture thinking and a keynote. We then will be followed by a very esteemed panel, and the panel will start off with Mr. Subhash Vashishth, the director of Svayam from India. We then will go to Professor Nick Tyler from the University College of London. And then we will hear from Mr. Fredrick Msigallah, who's an advocacy officer with a comprehensive community-based rehabilitation program in Tanzania. And last but not least, we will hear from Ms. Janett Jimenez-Santos, who's an architect from Mexico. We will then open up, and again, I really encourage you to ask questions. I think the earlier session was a great panel and lots of interesting questions. So without further ado, I'd like to invite you, Mohammed, to the stage to make your keynote. Thank you very much. Oh, and my name is Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo.
Good morning. Thank you, Charlotte. I want to start thanking the World Road Congress and DFID for inviting me to speak here today. It is an honor to speak in front of you, a global audience of thought leaders and innovators, addressing the very issue of accessible transportation, something that has affected me personally and affects millions of people around the world. My journey at the US Department of Transportation started with a focus on mobility and innovation, something that could impact the lives of people, not only the people with disabilities, but in general, the US population and our nation's highway and freeway systems. And as we were doing that, I came across a number of things that we spoke in the earlier session on road mapping, on infrastructure, on universal design, on procurements. What I saw soon, what I realized soon, is that the voice of disability wasn't there. And that led to the creation of a new program, which is something that I am going to speak as we go along today. And among all these, the underpinning is the issue of employment, education, access to healthcare, social and financial inclusion. And throughout my work, I realized that there is a direct linkage to transportation. The aspect of transportation really shapes the lives of people with disabilities, more so it does for other peers without disabilities. So as we go along this journey, what I'm going to present here is something that we all heard in the earlier session, which is the access to transportation is a key element, which is critical to provide opportunities for employment, education, healthcare, and independent living, as I mentioned. Poor or lack of accessible and reliable, affordable transportation can hinder social participation. That further reduces the livelihood of people with disabilities living or having a meaningful life. There are a number of data points on this that shed further light, such as this index on millions of people with disabilities living in the US. And we talked about how aging is going to be a factor. What we also know, the more you age, the more chances that you're going to have some kind of a disability. According to a study in 2015, the disability rate for ages 5 to 7 was 5.4%. For ages 18 to 64, the rate was 10.5%. And for people 65 and upper, it was 35%. What I'm going to go back now is to just shed some light on how transportation is linked. According to another study, alarming 30% of people with disabilities report difficulty accessing transportation for any of their daily living activities. About 13% of them report difficulty climbing stairs and walking. All of these have a great, again, impact on the way these people are able to live and be productive in society. Here is another chart which just shows the disparity you see between people with disabilities and compare those to people who do not have disability. Again, these are all numbers from the US. In 2017, 37% of people with disabilities in the US aged 18 and 64 were employed compared to 77.2% without disabilities. The employment rate vary by type of disabilities. The highest is for people who have hearing disabilities of over 50% or so. And I'm not going to go through all the other numbers, but the lowest is for self-care disabilities, which is at 16%. The median income, and this is something that really was shocking for me, the median income for an American with a disability age 16 was $23,000 compared to $35,000 for a similar person without a disability. Over 26% of Americans with disabilities of working age are living in poverty, compared to 11.1%. So simply put, these are all amazing numbers, and something that could really enable them to become a regular citizen, participant citizens, will go a long way. So these are all like decimal numbers. I mean, there are numbers you could look at which further shed light on the issues around disability. What was interesting was that in 2016, there was a report done with the help of Microsoft, organization, and few others, which then brought a new report called Getting to Equal. In that, what it talked about is the fact that if you were to enable inclusion, disability inclusion, this could really impact the bottom line. And this is something that was touched on in the morning as well, is to convert these numbers, the nuts and bolts, into cents and dollars. So this report, again, goes further to show that for every 1% unemployment reduction for people with disabilities, it could add roughly $25 billion to the GDP. A rough math could be like you just do this for 4 years, just driving this 1% change, you are at $100 billion. That will pretty much fund any of the infrastructure that you would need to enable accessible transportation worldwide. The slide don't seem to move. OK, from now on, I'm going to shift my focus, because this is something that I do. We talked about enabling technologies. We talked about innovation. There are a number of things that are happening, from automated driving vehicles to connected vehicles to connected infrastructure to connected pedestrians. What we don't hear and see often is the voice of people with disabilities, is the voice of travelers with disabilities at the table. And the fear is that as we go along, a lot of it is going to be left to designers who, with all good intention, may leave some of the critical elements that you need. And we have heard about how roads needs to be accessible. But imagine a day like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. That is what I do as a living, is the road mapping activity, the strategies that go along into making the nation's highway better. But imagine you are having an automated car come to pick you up. You have a vision disability, and your phone or your smartphone, you're not able to talk to the car. Those are the infrastructures. Those are the input and the output mechanisms. Those are the environment, the built environment and the pedestrian environment we need as we move forward. So this is kind of a eye chart, but this is the roadmap. This is the program I created at the US Department of Transportation. Over the last 5 years, we have gone through from the stakeholder engagement to doing all the foundational research that brought in thousands and hundreds of people who gave us feedback on what application areas we need to work on. That led to creation of 4 key aspects, and we divided that into key elements that what we are calling make a complete trip from point A to point B, before and after and in between. You need different technology elements that will play in this space to make a person with a disability, no matter what disability that the person has, be able to travel alongside any other person who does not have a disability. As I was mentioning, we had this idea of 4 segments. The segments were wayfinding and navigation, anything indoors and outdoors, a pre-concierge system, a system that will map the whole trip for you. If you have someone with autism, you understand the issues that they have. If they are able to map everything and that application gives you, like I have 5 stops during my journey, they are able to figure it out before they leave their house. First mile, last mile is something that we have all heard. But how first mile and last mile is looked at when using robotics and automated driving systems, you have a lot more possibilities. And once you get off, you need to go to your destination. The safe intersection crossing, any of the crossings that you need to do, how your traffic signals interact with a person with a disability, those were the 4 areas we targeted in like what I am showing on this slide. And maybe during the break and during Q&A, we could talk further, but I need to move on. I just want to show you one of the application areas which was funded 2 years ago. This application is kind of unique in the sense that you would think like these are all applications that are only possible in a country like US. But with the smartphones, things are changing. You don't need the same infrastructure. We need the minimum infrastructure. That is a new framework we could design to have applications which are innovative, which are different than what we have been used to seeing. Can you play the video, please?
Welcome to Wayfinder. Tap on the picture that matches the trip you want to take. Tap one more time to open this route. Please press the Start button to begin your route.
Wait here for the WC bus. AG Campus eastbound. This is not your stop. Ohio Union southbound. This is not your stop. Honors House. Your stop is next. Prepare to exit. This is your stop. Exit the bus.
So this is one example of several applications that we are working on. And this is something that could easily be implemented in a environment which does not have the type of infrastructure that you might imagine. Can we go back to the slides, please? So I briefly talked about this vision of complete trip. The reason I want to again emphasize and show this is this idea of segmenting your journey into 4 different pieces. And it starts with the pre-trip, the wayfinding and navigation, the first mile and the last mile, how robotics and automation could be used in that area, to safe intersection crossing after you get off. This actually is the new program or a vision that the new administration has adopted. And I'm happy to just say that this program alone is going to receive a new $40 million funding to demonstrate this concept. So the Accessible Transportation Research, the Technologies Research Initiative that I actually conceived and launched 5 years ago, is not the only program that the US Department of Transportation is working or leading. We have several other programs, including a very recent $60 million announcement on 8 different demonstration projects, all focused on automated driving systems, levels 3 and onwards. What I'm happy to say that again, in the 8 applications awards that were made, 5 of those included accessibility, disability as a criteria in that. Charlotte, how much time do I have? OK. So I have a couple of more slides, but I want to leave you with 2 thoughts. One is new technology innovations, if we are not at the table, if we don't bring the user needs, the scenarios, it's going to be designed without our knowledge, without our voice, and then it's going to take a long time. Universal design, we heard this, there are different aspects of universal design that could be applied in the new age, the new innovation that we are about to see. And this work, the work of accessible transportation, US alone, UK alone, we heard this, we cannot do it alone. We need all of you to work together. And especially as we are working on these high technology solutions, how can we also look at a minimum infrastructure requirement that could be applied for any other developing country? And lastly, there is one other video that I want to show before I go back. But again, thank you very much for inviting me. It is, again, an honor, and thank you so much. Can you play the last video, please?
For our society to function, mobility is a critical asset. Individuals need to be able to get to places on time and in the most efficient way possible. But what about individuals that face obstacles driving a car, riding the metro, or simply crossing the street? For many Americans with disabilities, this is their reality. So how can their lives be enhanced with more mobility options than ever before? The U.S. Department of Transportation's Accessible Transportation Technologies Research Initiative, or ATRI, is working on a path forward that utilizes innovative technologies to solve these problems. One of these technologies, connected vehicles, is already on the streets. They are able to communicate with each other, the roads, and our smart devices, sharing information about their speed, position, brake status, and more. Automated vehicles are being heavily researched and tested by automakers nationwide. And as connectivity with the Internet of Things expands, connected smart communities will form. In these developments, transportation, energy, public services, healthcare, public safety, and other services will communicate to improve coordination and efficiency. As we accelerate toward these technological breakthroughs and revolutionary transformations in the way we travel, we must ensure everyone is able to come along for the ride. Applications can enable pedestrians to use connected mobile devices to communicate with vehicles, traffic signals, and other infrastructure to safely cross an intersection. Or they can provide travelers with turn-by-turn directions during their trips through smart devices, including wearable technologies. Travelers can be assisted by collaborative robots at transport terminals, home, work, and healthcare destinations. These applications can also help plan routes and provide virtual caregiver support along the way. Even tasks such as grocery shopping can be improved through the use of automated vehicles. ATRI's vision is a transformative transportation network that is accessible to all travelers, regardless of their disabilities. Get involved and help us make this vision a reality. The future is within reach.
Thank you, Mohammed, for an excellent presentation. And I think I like the hashtag. I would not just say the future is in reach, I would say the future is accessible. I think some key points coming out of your presentation for me was just reinforcing the fact that we're not talking about an insignificant population. We're talking about a large group of people. And I will ask some of my panelists to think about what this means for people with invisible disabilities, and we'll come to that in a bit. But I think some of the things that really stood out in your presentation for me, Mohammed, was looking at the income disparities and looking at the inequalities that persons with disabilities experience because of exclusion, because they're not able to use transportation and therefore are not able to take up opportunities which would enable them to participate in society. And then I also really want to thank you for introducing the ideas and the thinking around using technology, but ensuring that technology is accessible to persons with disabilities, because if we're going down that route and it's not accessible, it means people with disabilities will continue to be marginalized and excluded. And then I just think finally, one point that you made very strongly was that there is a body of research. So we're not starting from zero. Work is happening. Obviously, we need to build it up. It needs to be more evidence-based and more robust, but there is a lot happening currently, certainly in your line of work and elsewhere. What I'd like to do now is to pivot to the panel, and I'm going to start with Subhash and ask him to give us a sense of what inclusive transport means in your country, and how do you address that in situations where you have constrained budgets?
Thank you, Charles. I think I would start with the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, we are celebrating 150th anniversary. And he used to say, when you plan for the most marginalized, you include everyone. And this is a man-made environment. It's not made by nature. And when it's a man-made, it should be made for every human being. So that's the basic philosophy that we begin with. And I also want to bring a point home, is road is not just for vehicles. Pedestrians included, wheelchair users included, all people are included. And traffic means not just vehicles again. The major challenge that we generally have is when we plan the road only for vehicles. That's the sensitization level that we need to really get in. How traffic is being handled in India. I think active, very active and aware user group is something that India is proud of, and we have come this far. There have been frequent public interest litigations, advocacy, which is quite strongly in the public domain, which is, I can quote a small example. In Delhi, the Delhi government was bringing semi-low floor buses, which were inaccessible because there was a fleet requirement of close to 1,000 buses. Because of cost variations, they wanted to bring in a semi-low floor, and the PIL went by a person with disability, and court said no. No public transport can be brought in the city which is inaccessible. So that's the level of involvement of the active users. Also, you need to have right standards, good laws that thankfully are there in the country. The political leadership is must. We had Accessibility a campaign in 2015, which has changed the whole landscape of accessibility, not just in built environment, but also in public transportation, ICT, and all service delivery systems. Another area is that we've been dealing with is training and empowerment. So I think this subject has already been dealt, and we've been training architects, we've been training transport engineers to instill that confidence, yes, this can be done, and the way it should be changed. When money is limited, I think it's not a question if it is done at the right time. If you plan it in the right way, money is not an issue. It's only for retrofitting that you have close to 30% of budgets for accessibility improvements. So we need to have local solutions if the money is limited. Not necessarily need to go for very costly technology or costly equipments. It can be localized solutions as well, because the idea is to include everyone. And if you think of access not as an economic cost, but as an economic benefit that was very succinctly conveyed in by earlier speakers, best way to engage persons with disabilities to us in India is involve them in all places, not just as customers or employees, in all forms that you can engage with for every positive feedback on policy, feedback on other things. Ask them their needs, they can tell you the best. How do you ensure seamless chain of access? I would say access is not a one-time affair. It's a continuous process. And it's also constantly evolving. We have seen islands of accessibility, wonderfully done, not connected, multiple agencies involved. That has been our biggest challenge, because each agency is working in silos. That's a challenge that we are trying to negotiate, because unless this is done, there is no seamless chain of accessibility happening. They must interact. You need to have regular access audits. This is era of innovation. And I think technology is something that we should look at using to address this change. A lot of organizations say we don't have money, the money is short. And so the best example that our law, the Indian Rights of Persons with Disabilities gives is, it gives you a 5 years window. And each year you need to plan. And planning not just for accessibility, but planning for all the new schemes that are coming up, or the annual maintenance, include accessibility as an essential component in those. And gradually, I'm sure in 5 to 10 years, things would be inclusive, things would be accessible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Key takeaways from that, I think laws exist, often not enforced. In India, maybe some enforcement. Resources in terms of cost may not always be the major constraint, but I think you really emphasize the importance of planning. Plan, 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 plan for accessibility, and I think that that's a point well taken. And I think the other point that really resonated certainly with me was the importance of including persons with disabilities themselves in the planning. And here, I think the mantra from the disability movement of nothing about us without us really rings loud. So thank you very much for those comments. Now we will move to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Professor Tyler. And Nick, if you could just maybe talk a bit about how do we address the needs of persons with invisible disabilities? I mean, traditionally, people think about disabilities as somebody like myself, because you can see my disability. People think about disability in terms of blindness, in terms of deafness, so more the physical. But there's a whole vast array of other types of disabilities. If you could speak about that a bit. And then perhaps to just segue on from some of the points made by the earlier speakers, how do we actually monitor and ensure that the laws that we have in place, the policies we have in place, are indeed enforced? A big one, I know.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see accessibility in a mainstream event such as the World Roads Congress. It's taken a very, very long time to get to this point, but I think it's actually very important that we are actually here discussing these kind of issues. In terms of hidden disabilities, invisible disabilities kind of actually captures a bit of the problem, because that assumes that we can see everything. And actually, there's a lot of people's capabilities that we can't see. And to sort of kick off on that, I start thinking, why do we talk about disability when actually we should be looking at what people can do? And the more I work with disabled people, the more I discover the amazing things that they can do. And how do we actually champion what we can learn from people who manage to move around the world in a way that other people don't have to think about? Because that helps us to understand how this sort of works. So one issue, I think, in hidden disabilities is multiple disabilities. People who are blind and deaf. We make assumptions about what we can see, but what we can't see is hidden away. So how do we actually pass information, for example, to people in that world? Another condition I think that's actually really important is people who are susceptible to stress. We often don't think of stress as a disability, but actually we have many systems in the world that are designed to invoke stress, to make us try to cross the road faster for example. Look at the signals that are given to pedestrians about how to cross a road faster, and you discover that what they're really trying to do is scare them into crossing the road faster, while the person in their car is sitting there waiting impatiently to pass the crossing. So we've kind of got our world a bit upside down, and we should really be, I think, trying to recognize that Homo sapiens, human beings, are actually a social species. We actually function as a species that communicates and interacts with other people. And that should not depend on the sum of our capabilities. It should simply be the way it is. So how do we design our transport systems to be able to recognize that actually what we need to be able to do is to enable people to live their lives, to be included in society as a social necessity for our continued existence on the planet? Because if humans cannot actually interact with each other, we will not survive. That comes into issues around autonomous cars and the technology. I think there are great opportunities with these technologies, but we have to recognize that it may not be possible for everybody to be able to access those technologies. How does a person with dementia know how to turn the phone on? That's a really tricky problem. So I think we need to sort of think through how we actually start from the real base of how we can assume what people can or can't do and work upwards from that, rather than make assumptions that they can do certain things or that they can't. In terms of monitoring and enforcing developments, that's an interesting one. I would blame my own sector. I work in a university. I think we are not training people to monitor and evaluate, and we're not training people to design accessibly. And if you can't teach people in my institution how to do that, then we are failing the future generations, because my students are the people who will be doing this in the future. So I think there is a radical reform needed in education of planners, engineers, architects, all the people who are associated with these issues in transport. And also, I would say, for the general population, I would have education in schools so that everybody is actually aware of the needs of people with different capabilities. This should not be something which is simply left to people in so-called professions. It should be something that people as a whole in the population understand totally that this is the way the world is, and that people, whatever their situation, actually are a full member of society and need to be treated as such. That seems to me a basic issue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. So what I heard you saying is that it's important for us to move away from like the deficit model or the defectology model of disability and really look at what people can do. And I think that's a very important point for people who are engaged in the transport sector. And I think, you know, your point around make no assumptions is really key, because sometimes people think they're doing the right thing, but they haven't spoken to disabled people's groups, so they don't know that they're doing the right thing. And then I really appreciated you taking the hit for not training and teaching your students and students writ large more about the importance of this issue. And I think this is a message more broadly, how we ensure that education at universities is a lot more thoughtful and addresses these issues. And I think, you know, the final word that I heard you say is that this is everybody's business, and we should all be involved in this. So now we're going to go to Tanzania, and Fred is going to tell us, I think, a bit about what we've heard is the importance of having persons with disabilities involved, engaged, in stakeholder engagement, in policy consultation. But how do we do this? How do we actually do this? For those who don't know the mechanisms of that, could you maybe just enlighten the audience, Fred?
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm sharing the experience of what we are doing in my home country, Tanzania, on how do we best engage people with disabilities in development process so that their needs are reflected in the development programs. One and the most important thing is to put people with disabilities at the center of development. They need to be part and parcel of the development processes. They should be able to identify their own needs, and strategy to address those needs has to be developed and well-financed so as to ensure that they also participate from the designing, in the implementation, in the monitoring and evaluation of whatever program is being implemented. But also we need to work in partnership with disability organizations. Anything that we're doing back in my home country, we work with the Federation of Persons with Disability, because these are the ones who are having the people that we like to include. If, for example, working in employment project, we are working in education project. Now, how do we get people with disabilities? It's by working with these organizations, because people with disabilities, through their organizations, they are the experts. They know the problems that they face and how they can even give suggestions on how those problems can be identified. So it's important that we work with DPOs, different types of disabilities, so that we know how to include each type of disability in the development program. But also, another thing that has been, of course, mentioned by my other colleagues, panelists, is ensuring accessibility. If we are talking about providing health services, how do you ensure people with disabilities can access those services? In terms of financial, are they affordable? In terms of infrastructure, the health facilities where these services are provided are accessible to people with disabilities. You need to look at whether the staff or the health providers are aware of how to handle a person with disability who is coming to get health services in that particular facility. So the whole issue of awareness raising to a health provider or to development actors is crucial to ensure effective participation of people with disability. But again, you need to ensure that you build the capacity of people with disabilities to engage. Don't assume that they can be engaged effectively in whatever intervention or development initiative they are taking unless you build their capacity. You build their capacity in terms of creating awareness on their right to participate, but also training them or making them aware to the legal framework on how they can, how their rights are protected in the Constitution, in the Disability Act, or what kind of policies are there to promote their participation. But also we cannot overlook the issue of collecting and documenting statistics for disability. You are planning, you need to have evidence. You are evaluating your program, you need to have evidence, and you get evidence from the data. In developing countries, we have a problem. We don't have enough data for planning, and therefore, sometimes our development programs are not, reflecting the reality because we don't have data. But ensuring of enough resources is also very important. Resources in terms of finance, you need to have enough resources to support, to finance inclusive, initiative. But also you need to have resources in terms of expertise. Train the experts who can build the capacity of the development actors on how to include people with disabilities. But also ensuring participation of people with disability in decision-making is important. We say nothing for us without us. So it's very important to ensure that people with disabilities are represented in decision-making bodies at different levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fred. I think you're very clear on the point around making sure that you put persons with disabilities at the center of development. And you're very strong on emphasizing the importance of ensuring that people with disabilities are part of the entire project cycle. And that's important from the design, supervision, and throughout. You need to have an iterative process where people with disabilities are being included, as well as their organizations. And then I think another very valid point you make is that in order to ensure that that's happening in a way that is robust, we need to insist that we build the capacity of disabled people's organizations, so the DPOs that you spoke about. And that will really help drive the demand side of the equation, and that's very important for what we're discussing today. And then finally, thank you for raising the importance of disability disaggregated data, because we need that for evidence planning, for evidence policy, based policy, and so thank you so much. That was a great set of comments. We're now going to go to Janett, who's sitting right at the end. Janett, and for you, if you could maybe just shed some light on how we address the issues that we're discussing today in resource-constrained environments. And I know you've been doing some really interesting work in that regard. And then also, if you could perhaps just share your perspective in terms of how we address the needs of people with invisible disabilities or people with intersecting identities. So, it could be a woman with a disability who might be from an indigenous community. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the questions that was posed that I found very interested was about how to tackle all these issues when money is limited. And the obvious answer will be, well, we have to look at planning, which are the needs on transportation. And as you just mentioned, we don't have data, and sometimes we don't have money to make surveys, so we have just to make immediate solutions. So I will say the first thing is that we need to know which are the resources that we have at that moment. And I would like just to put an example in a case study in Mexico, where there was a special needs school, and one of the Ministry of Education phoned me and told me, we're having a lot of accidents around the schools. Students with disabilities are being run over just to arrive to the school. And I said, well, who are the ones who are having these problems? And I said, well, the parents are the ones who are very worried about this. And I said, well, then you have to include the parents in the solution. So the first thing that was done was to volunteer the parents in the crossing points, to be able to work, and especially in the peak hours. But afterwards, the teachers said, well, we want to work on mobility issues. Students with disabilities need to be independent in their adult life, so we have to teach them how to cross the street, how to use public transport, etc. So the teachers were involved in all these pedestrian crossing points, and they found out that it was very important to paint the zebra lines, that somebody with an intellectual disability will tell them, well, it is safe to cross the street in this point. So it's really important to have the paintings on the pedestrian crossing points. So later on, the director of that school asked authorization to the building work department, well, I need to do some painting in these pedestrian crossing points, and they said, well, we don't have the money to do it. So they said, well, could you please give me the standards of how can we have to draw and paint the line? So then during the weekends, the parents were the ones who helped painting these pedestrian crossing points. So that's why I mean that you need to know which are the resources. Sometimes you don't have financial resources, but you might have human resources. So everything is about implementation. We really want to have final products. We want to have accessible final products. And I have to refer here that we have a very powerful implementation tool for the Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which is the new urban agenda. And we have sustainable mobility plans. And I think in Latin America, we're changing from having transport plans towards mobility plans. That means that we are stopping having departments of transport, we're having departments of mobility. And what is about this is, what is a mobility plan? It's having strategies for the pedestrians, which we know that road safety is an issue. I mean, we have to look after the safety of pedestrians crossing points for different people. I mean, when we talk about accessibility, it's not only about ramp. When we talk about pedestrian crossing points, it's a bit more. What is the strategy for cyclists? What is the strategy for public transport? And when we talk about public transport and when we talk about accessibility, we're not talking only about mass transport, we're talking about door-to-door services, ramp, taxis, and Uber, and even like Uber applications. I mean, how are they working and how are they intervening to promote accessible transport? And I think they have there something that they still can give. They can give a button saying, you can use a ramp taxi in your application. And so we have to put together all these strategies, and that's what the mobility plan is about. How to put together this and how to include inclusion in this, because we know that it's not only about disability, it's about gender, it's about indigenous people, migrants, immigrants. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Janett. Sorry. And I think, again, key messages out of that, the importance of the SDGs. I think that's definitely the trending theme for the day. But I think also very importantly, or very interestingly, the point that you make about Latin America moving away from transport plans to mobility plans, that really takes a different dimension, I think. And that's very interesting, and I'm sure there are lots of people in the room that would be interested to hear a bit more about that. I think your point around us not just focusing on mass transit is very important, because there are a whole host of other types of transportation. So this is actually an excellent pivot for me to ask Amin Andani to speak a bit about some of the work he's been doing, because he's been working with making accessible rickshaws. And so that's a great pivot. I think there should be a mic on the table.
Yes, so my name is Amin Andani. I'm from Pakistan. I think there is a major requirement to promote and showcase the cause that disability inclusion is beneficial for all. I'll give you an example of our experience, which is not directly related to transportation. So Pakistan, textile sector is the biggest employer in Pakistan. So a few years back, we were reaching out to them to place people with disabilities. So what happened, like they were reluctant to hire people with disabilities, but we finally got a chance to place a few persons with disabilities in the workplaces. And then after a few months, we made very fancy presentations for those employers. We asked them to send these presentations and these videos to their global buyers. And when they sent these videos and these fancy presentations to global buyers like Levi's, Zara and all, they received amazing response from there. And even they were like asking, the textile sector was asking to have more persons with disabilities from our organization. Now, hundreds of persons with disabilities are working in these workplaces. Wow. So it's a major requirement. Another project that we're running, which is, for transportation, it's called the Rickshaw project, which we have made, where we have retrofitted hand-controlled rickshaws for persons with disabilities. They can drive those rickshaws, and it is equipped with few facilities, so persons with disabilities can also have a ride on those rickshaws. So, highlighting benefits of having persons with disabilities in the mainstream is very important. 3 examples. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. So let's open up the floor for reflections, ideas, comments, questions, thoughts. Yes, please, over here to the gentleman on, yep. If you could just say your name, please, and if you're directing it to a particular speaker. If not, just talk.
I'm John Miles from the UK. It's a comment for the panel as a whole. In Europe and North America in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen increasing interest in the idea of mobility as a service. And there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment to find the business models that will make this successful. And so my comment and request of the panel is, are there opportunities to capitalize on this? And who would you see as being the main force for change, who might pick up the business model and make it available for the market sectors that we're talking about? Because it's a very diverse range of individual requirements, and surely we do now have the opportunities to think very carefully about how we market our mobility services in this way.
Great question. Can we get another one? Bernard? Can we get the mic to Bernard, please?
Thank you. My name is Bernard Obika from the UK. Just questions directed to Professor Tyler. He reinforced the need to get this particular theme into the agenda in training institutions. How can we get the topic into the curricula, not only in the developed world, but in low-income countries, particularly in the colleges and universities in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa?
Let's take one more question from the floor, right next to Bernard, and then we'll do another round.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Patrick Maléjac, Secretary General of PIARC. First of all, thank you to all of you guys for joining the Congress. I really, really appreciate that. And thank you to the UK and DFID in particular for making it happen, and DFT, of course. Anyway, I have a remark and a question, and a proposal. The remark is on a particular topic. I've heard, as in many sessions, or in the future, more autonomous vehicles or whatever will make things possible. To what extent is this an excuse not to act now? I wonder. In the future, everything will be brighter. Of course it will. I wouldn't want decision makers to take that as an excuse not to do anything now. Because waiting for a bright future is kind of easy. And my question is, at PIARC World Road Association, we are mostly discussing interurban roads. Not only, but mostly. And we have a committee on urban issues, a committee on organization of transport administrations, but mostly pavements, asset management, etc. So the question to you guys is, have you identified areas in that range of issues on which we should be doing something immediately that I would be happy to put on the agendas of our committees? Because we're not necessarily aware of everything. And the proposal here is that we've launched a call for members of our committees. We've asked our member countries to appoint experts from all over the world to all of these committees. And I really believe that a great way to progress the agenda would be maybe for some of the panelists or experts with disabilities, be they physical or mental or otherwise, to join some of PIARC's committees as experts. Well, I don't know if we have many countries represented in the room, quite a few it seems, but I will push it at some point. Thank you.
Okay, that was really great, an excellent proposal. I think we certainly see lots of nods. But to the panel, from John Miles, mobility as a service. Yeah. How do we use that business model to really shore up the support, taking into account the diversity of disability? And I see Janett wants to talk to that. Then the question from Bernard directly to you, Professor Tyler, around how do we do this? I mean, you say you haven't done it, and his question is pushing you a bit more to say, how do we do this? And how do we do it in South Asia, in African universities? How do we ensure that curricula is inclusive? And then I think Patrick's question is to all. And I have to say I completely agree with him that, you know, now is the time, and we should not be letting anybody off the hook. I think the SDGs are time-bound, and therefore we need to be thinking about that within a timeline. But then let's have each one of you think about what are some of the areas that PIARC should be addressing in terms of disability inclusion, and then the proposal, I see again lots of nods. But let me start with Janett and come back down this way for any reflections on the first set of comments.
Yes, normally that's an issue about having an economic model to be able to function transport. And as I said, I mean, there are different modes of transport. No, I mean, we have to have an economic model to work for massive transport, for door-to-door services, which is it might be a different model, and for special services. One of the things that I have always said is that we need incentives for the private sector, but we need first to have clear rules. I mean, to have, for the private sector to come inside and say, yes, I'm going to invest, they have to have clear rules, so the regulations have to be clear, so there is no corruption, because that's one of the things that happens in our countries. So I think we have to have more incentives for the private sector, you know, to be ordered to really make it happen.
Fred, any thoughts on the questions? Any thoughts?
I do. I mean, I can.
Please go ahead.
I think mobility as a service is a great opportunity, which is kind of being missed at the moment. For me, the great thing is, I think it's a real market for the sort of young startup entrepreneurial kind of company, and I don't mean the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. I mean actually the kind of company that can target people who need that last and first mile service, and that how we actually combine the provision of a transport service that actually delivers the mobility to everybody, but not necessarily everybody at the same time. So how we actually make it much more particular to the needs of particular people is something which I think mobility as a service could really do if it put its mind to it. And I think at the moment that it isn't quite where it's going. I think it feels to me that the sector is looking at kind of exotic taxis rather than something which will actually drive at users' needs. And I think the kind of issue that we're discussing today is an area where mobility as a service could actually really be a very positive and powerful way forward, but we kind of have to get it talking to the right people and understanding what the potential users' needs might be and how they might then supply them. But I think the secret is in actually the entrepreneurial sector rather than the mainstream.
Great.
Yeah. I think I'll have two angles of looking at it. Mobility as a service has actually done wonders in the country. When I go back to India, a lot of young people have shifted. They're shunning their own cars. They're shifting to Ubers and Olas and taxis. I would go a step beyond. Mobility as a service would also include duties on municipalities to have pedestrian sidewalks that are usable. The law for services is very categorical as of today. It demands accessibility of services. The second point that I want to bring your attention to is, if mobility as a service is provided to persons with disabilities or people who require little additional services at a higher premium, which is currently the case, The moment you have accessible vehicles, they are like almost double the cost. Services which are a little more additional in nature to include people with disabilities bring additional cost. That's perhaps is a cause of worry. I mean, that we need to somehow address this. As a concept, mobility as a service is fantastic. I think this leaves, a lot more revenues for the entrepreneurs to address it.
Mohammed, I'm going to ask you maybe to just think a bit about what are some of the areas that you think PIARC should be thinking about in terms of this agenda?
Yeah, so from PIARC point of view, some things that I've noticed is there is a lot of focus on road and roadways and design of those. Again, pardon me, this is my first time at PIARC, so I may not have the depth and the knowledge that is embodied in this organization. But when you talk about the new technology elements, you need to also start to focus on the environment surrounding the individual and the different elements that touch that individual to make their journey. And when I say that, you have the built environment, the transportation terminals, the hubs, the airports, the railway stations, the bus stops. And then you have the pedestrian environments, the journey you have to take some ways, whether you are in a wheelchair, on a guide dog, on a cane. What different elements could touch you to connect you to the system? So there are elements of interfaces that you would need that provide the opportunity to have this input mechanism or the output mechanism. The ability for you, if you have a vision disability or someone who has autism and is cognitively limited, how are they able to interact with the system? When, imagine in 10 years, 15 years down the road, we are talking about this whole mobility as an option, but you have a totally autonomous car come get you. Does it really understand the need from a person with a vision to a cognitive, to a hearing, to a physical disability?
Great. Any more questions from the floor? Daniela, I know you had a question, and I see Claire also has a question, and Anne. So let's do that round.
One area that we have, excuse me, one area we haven't touched on so far is around rural issues, and I'm interested to hear from the panel how that has been considered and approached within their particular areas.
Okay, Daniela.
Mobility. Patrick said that they might like to consider having experts with disabilities in the various areas that are being discussed when it comes to roads, not necessarily only roads and persons with disabilities, right? To mainstream experts with disabilities in all areas. So I would like to ask you, Janett, when you said that in Latin America or in Mexico, from the Ministry of Transport, you're moving to the Ministries of Mobility. What is mobility in this case? It could be also something interesting for all of us, and Patrick maybe, to learn about. Thank you.
Great. Anne?
Thank you very much. First, can I say a huge thank you to Patrick for inviting us to be engaged with PIARC, and frankly, that's a challenge we can't afford not to take up. So we will be looking for volunteers. We will flood your committees if you're not careful. But thank you very much for that. I also wanted to raise, on the question of technology, a fear that I have about older people being left behind. Increasingly, things are technology dependent. Certainly in countries like the UK, if you want to buy a train ticket, if you want to do anything in the way of transport, you need to go online, you need to interact with the machine. And yet a lot of older people either can't do that or don't want to do that. The thing that they want above all is the presence of uniformed staff. We're somehow losing that concept, and the same applies for mobility as a service. Very often you can only access it through your smartphone, through the internet. We risk leaving behind a generation who are not tech savvy. And I think it's a mistake to think that it's just the current generation of older people, because each of us, as we get to a certain age, will find we've been left behind because technology is moving faster. So I think a question to all of the panel: how do we make sure that in our excitement about technology, which can do wonderful things, we don't leave behind our older generation? Thank you.
Great set of questions. Any initial takers? Fred, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, if I could start with the honest concern, leaving behind people with disabilities with the advancement in the technology. I think this is a valid thing that to think about, particularly in developing countries. Yeah? In the developed countries, we are far ahead, and many people with disabilities probably have access to education compared to people with disabilities in developing countries. I could imagine back home in rural areas, people with disabilities do not have even a smartphone, and most of them have not gone to school. So when it comes to interaction with the technology, it's still a challenge. But there are some initiatives that are taking place right now back home. There are some training institutions, even universities, that have established a special program for people with disabilities, teaching them the issue of technology. People with visual impaired are being trained on how to use computer, how to use internet and all that. I think those are initiatives that need to be capitalized. But also, how do we make the technology affordable to people with disabilities who most of them are poor, they cannot afford? That's something that still needs to be discussed, because yeah, they might be available but not affordable, and people with disabilities might not be able to afford to buy such expensive advanced technology equipment. That's something that we still need to consider and think about it. Thanks.
I think, thank you for raising that point. I mean, I can immediately relate this to how Delhi Metro, when it shifted the entire operations and they removed the customer care staff, and they shifted to machines to buy a token, or to buy a coupon, a travel card, and everything is processed through a travel card. You could do it through Paytm. And a lot of people, not just elderly people, a lot of people coming from different strata, different education backgrounds, from different parts of the country, not very knowledgeable about technology, had this problem. And while doing these access audits for Delhi Metro, we strongly suggested to provide two things, which they agreed. One is a designated phone line. So that's a traditional method that people believe that they're talking to a human voice, not just press 1 for this, press 2 for this. So they can share the problem. Second was retain at least one customer care counter where people with disabilities, people who have some issues dealing with technologies can visit. And also, they have gone a step ahead. They have a volunteer who's posted around those machines to negotiate all those technicalities. But people do not have that comfort when it comes to sharing your economic details, your bank details, passwords. So they're very susceptible to, very vulnerable to situations. So I think we need to reassure that you're not being left behind. We are working with you. And of course, I think the wonderful arrangement of training programs, the Delhi Metro, I believe they keep doing some interactions with groups of people with disabilities on what facilities are there, how can use technology. That should go a long way.
Mohammed?
So if I may add, there needs to be what I call the Apple phenomena. People didn't know what a smartphone would look like before you actually had a technology to work with. So there needs to be more work on the human factor side, designing it in such a way that it is very easy for someone to use. And then you also have to somehow be innovative. So a Smart Cities project in Columbus, Ohio, in the US, where the US Department put in $60 million, and together with our partners, it was over a $100 million project. So Google had a startup called Sidewalk Labs. They were the ones who were going to provide these huge giant displays, that you will provide on street corners and in grocery shops and such. And the idea was that it will be designed in such a way that it is very intuitive and you're able to communicate for people who do not have access to smartphones and other technologies. So I think there is still like a event horizoning kind of approach, where you need more work on designing these simple interactions that people can do. One other quick thought on the rural side is that the general tendency is to think that we need the kinds of infrastructure that you need in a urban setting. But if you were to think of the minimum set, and keep mentioning that, but I think there is a possibility that that could be done. So in the recent awards on automated driving systems that literally happened end of September, there was a specific call to look at rural applications of automated driving systems. And you can geofence a small location and have these applications be able to provide transportation. It is in some ways is much easier than tackling the issue of congestion and the interaction the vehicles would have to do with the mixed traffic in like an urban setting. The same scenarios and same issues don't exist, in a rural area.
Great. Janett, do you want to respond to Daniela's question around how you define mobility in the Latin American context?
Sure. I mean, to make it short, mobility is how are we going to share in the roads people with different users and different modes of transport. So how are we going to interact with each other? I mean, for example, somebody might arrive in a bicycle, leave their bicycle in a bus stop, and then from the bus stop, take massive transport. So this is talking about the travel chain. And something that you mentioned, I mean, very accurate, is that we want to mainstream these mobility aspects about disability. We don't want to make special things for disabled people. We want to mainstream it and be included in these strategies, in this pedestrian strategy, in this public transport strategy. That's the only thing that I think we're asking here. So that is mobility. And we know that there are other modes of transport coming up. I mean, now we have share bicycles, share rides. So this, we have to see how does disability is included in all these new modes of transport.
Great. I'm going to ask again if there are any questions, comments from the floor. Yes, I see a hand. And I'm going to also ask the panelists to start thinking about what they would like as their last kind of one-line message.
Hello, Annabelle Bradbury from the UK. Just going back to the question about rural access, and the response was related to sort of autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles. But in low-income countries, which is where I work predominantly, and rural access, often you're talking about basic rural access, so it's very difficult for able-bodied people, but for people with disabilities, it's it's a very isolating experience, and a lot of these sort of technology solutions are just not viable. So I just wanted to hear from the panel about where people are really being left behind in terms of development and the SDGs, and those people with disabilities, how we can sort of bring them out of poverty through mobility.
Okay, great question. Anything else from the floor? Any other questions, comments, observations? Graham?
Thank you. Sorry, this is yet another person from the UK. I think we're hogging the floor a bit. Fantastic presentations, by the way. Thank you so much. And great from Patrick, I know who's just left the room. My question really to the panel was, you've all travelled from your homes in the US, India, Tanzania, Mexico, etc., to this international congress here, and that's quite an epic journey for anybody. Thinking about that kind of door-to-door journey from when you stepped outside your house and then you arrived at this place here, what worked for you and what didn't work for you, and what lessons can you kind of share with us about that experience?
Okay, great. That's an awesome question. And should we get started perhaps with Fred? On the rural, it might be useful for you to talk a bit about Tanzania and what it means for people with disabilities in rural areas. And then if we could all think about our journey from home to airport, airport to hotel. Fred.
Yeah, for rural areas, like case from Tanzania, I mean, people in rural areas, I think even like more disadvantaged compared to the people in urban areas. And most of them, in terms of infrastructure, public transport facilities are not good. Of course, even urban areas, but in rural areas, it's even worse. So for them to move from one point to point B for, say, employment or go to school is a challenge. But also accessing information of the opportunities available, say for entrepreneurship or any employment, for them it's very difficult. Hardly they access newspapers, they hardly have TVs where they can watch and get information. So for them, I think there should be deliberate efforts of ensuring that the policies and laws that promote inclusive development are implemented in rural areas to create awareness, first, of their rights, but also government to have affirmative action. For example, in my case, given the fact that the opportunity for economic opportunity for people are limited in rural areas, now, last year, the government passed a law that requires local government authorities to set aside at least 2% of local resources to support income generation activities for people with disabilities. This is something very new. It used not to be there, but we need again to educate people with disabilities. They own the availability of these opportunities and how they can make use of these opportunities. Then I think the very important thing in this case, really to ensure that all countries, including my country, that have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, they put strategies and allocate enough resources to ensure that access to economic opportunities, access to transport and other services is realized among people with disabilities, particularly in rural areas. My experience from home to here, of course, in terms of accessibility, Abu Dhabi is far ahead. They are much better in terms of facilities. I didn't get any challenge. I got all the assistance that I needed. And of course, in Tanzania, just like 2 months, we launched a new airport, which is now, accessible. So it was really a very good experience. And what I'm learning, actually, even here, I was like trying to get myself to the platform here without assistance. I managed to do that. I think these are the things that I'm taking home to say, hey, guys, we can also make such kind of facilities accessible to people with disabilities. Otherwise, back home, it would have been difficult for me to come to the platform and, give my presentation. So these are the lessons that I'm taking back home. Thank you, DFID, and all the organizers for giving me such a wonderful opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Fred. Let's see who hasn't. Yeah, maybe Nick.
Yes, rural areas. I think we have to start with the premise that we're dealing with people, and in a sense, we need all of these other things to suit the people. So if we can start to think about how do we actually bring the development that people can actually live their lives as fully as possible, may mean that we have to think that they don't need to travel quite so much. We have to sort of get the balance right. And maybe rural areas have economic opportunities that are not being realized as yet, and therefore we can bring those kind of opportunities to the people as much as taking the people or requiring the people to have to make journeys in order to reach them. I think there's a really important balance politically and policy terms to figure that one out. In terms of my journey here, well, yes, I don't really have very much to say really, because it was sort of kind of accessible to me. Tomorrow I go to Lima, and in Lima that will be much more difficult, I think, for people. So I would hesitate to say too much about the journey here. I mean, I arrived on an aeroplane that flew. That was quite an achievement, you know.
Subhash, any idea? Any thoughts?
I think it's lopsided development where whole of the funding that goes to urban areas, rural areas are being actually left behind. And it becomes critical in terms, when you have natural calamities like floods and other problems, road gets washed away, all infrastructure gets washed away. It's a huge problem. And to me, the mobility is not just roads. It starts from the person's bed where he's lying down. Roads are accessible, the person can't come out of the house. That's the condition in village areas. The immediate connectivity, the water channel immediately outside the house makes the huge barrier for him. So mobility starts from there, and those are the areas perhaps they need to be addressed, and basic roads and connecting dots to necessary places where the person is required to go in a rural economy, to the marketplace, to the school, to the shop, to the doctor, hospital. So these basic connectivity, if could be provided, that should be the aim, in fact. I mean, as of today, it's just negligible. The whole funding is more on giving subsidies to farmers, or doing major highways, or connecting those roads from highways to the villages. But it is very critical in areas like difficult areas like mountain regions, in desert areas, even in cities, in the slums. They're completely inaccessible. I mean, 2 feet wide, a street, can't have accessibility. So those are the basic problems that countries are tackling. And the right approach, I would say, I completely agree with Professor Taylor that we need to take services to them within that network, and also then connect them to the nearest hub where people can easily visit. Regarding my travel from India, yeah, I think it is difficult for us to plan, because the planning starts from the first link, getting the taxi to the airport in time. And when your app doesn't work due to low connectivity, you get delayed by 15 minutes and your palpitation starts. Though you want to be there at 3 hours before, and you end up getting at the nick of the time, you're entering. And so all those complications are much more stressful for so-called able-bodied people. And think of people who walk slow, who are in their aging process, or people with disabilities. It's a nightmare. We aren't still ready for it. We aren't still ready.
Mohammed, your journey.
So there is this there's this fear factor, when you leave your home and onto a different country, and that sets in, But I started to talk about the intent and the desire to do good, and while you think that may be the case, you don't really end up doing that. What do I mean by that? So there are two examples. As soon as I got to the airport, I was going to use the restroom. And the restroom, the guy actually pointed me to what would be an accessible restroom. In fact, the space is so designed that while it has like what you would call all the accessible elements in it, it is so narrow that I am not able to fully be able to use that. So in fact, I prefer to go in a different stall, which is not designed for access. And the biggest surprise came to me as we were walking through the immigration line. And I'm not sharing this example in a negative way, but to raise awareness that while there is intent, there is also needs to be these aspects of the user need, and how you could do inclusive elements to bring a person with a disability. So the example is, at the immigration line, we were first going through the normal route. And as we handed my passport, I'm in a wheelchair. The wheelchair is being pushed by one of the airport caregivers. And the lady looks at the passport and she goes like, in Arabic, you have to go to such and such. What it meant was that we needed to go to a special desk that is designed for a traveler with a disability. And that desk says people with determination, but it is designed in such a way that I'm not able to see the lady, I'm not able to have a conversation. So aspects like that, really surprise you. I mean, and I didn't know what, so literally the caregiver or the wheelchair pusher was talking to me and communicating that with the person. At the end, I got my passport back, and while I felt like, I had a special treatment, I was not really that, so with that I will end.
Yeah, so, I'll just say quickly about my journey. It was exceptionally seamless, which is often not the case, but I also recognize that thanks to the organizers, there was a lot of planning that went behind it. And I think for me, the ask is to have more standardized procedures so that you know what to expect and not have kind of random discussions about whether your wheelchair goes into the hold or onto the plane. And so, yeah, but for this particular journey, it was great. And then it was also really good to come here and see that we have sign language interpreters, which is always a very important piece when we think about the different types of disabilities. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it's up to me to close this session. I am not going to try and summarize everything, but I do think that there were a couple of salient points that emerged from the discussion. I think what we heard, both in the earlier session and in the second session, is that there is some really exciting work going on in this space. There is good research. Can we have more? Yes, absolutely. We could and we should. I think what we definitely heard was that we need to have more robust analysis that looks at costing and really get us to think about what is the economic argument around this. We also heard from speaker after speaker that this is not an insignificant population. Persons with disabilities make up at least 15% of the world's population. And it's a population that's not going to decrease in size. If anything, it's going to increase. And so for purposes of planning, how do we ensure that we're thinking about persons with disabilities? The issue around training of professionals in universities, job training, and ensuring that people understand what the needs are. How do you design for and with persons with disabilities is important. A point that was raised by Fredrick, the necessity of ensuring that persons with disabilities are at the center of any kind of development projects that we put in place. Picking up on the point by Janett, the importance of having incentives for the private sector, something that we haven't really talked about too much today, but I think very important. A couple of colleagues raised the promise that comes with technology. And the promise is huge. But that promise won't be realized by everybody if it's not accessible. And to Anne's point, if it's not something that people are taught and encouraged to use. I think we also heard from Daniela and from others that we have the frameworks, we have the SDGs in place. Now it's for us to go back and think about what this means in terms of policies, in terms of strategies, and how at national level we can cascade it down to ensure that we're looking at implementation and enforcement. And then finally, I think the greatest success perhaps for today was the great offer from PIARC. And I think we should definitely seize on that opportunity and make sure that we're thinking about disability in all of the committees. Lastly, I've been asked by the organizers, so by DFID, to invite you to their stall, which is in the exhibition room, and to go over there and to scan, using the QR code, a really great disability inclusion policy brief. Many of you will have either contributed to this, and I can assure you it's a great read. So please go over there and scan it, and it's been really a pleasure. I've had a wonderful set of panelists, great keynote speakers, and thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, PIARC, for having us. Thank you.